Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats for the next installment of this fascinating conference. My name is Paul Eakins. I'm at University College London and with the UNEP International Resource Panel. It's my pleasure to be moderating this session with four wonderful speakers who I shall introduce very briefly just before they give their 5-6 minutes worth of introduction, so they will locate themselves in our topic, which is from extractive to regenerative value chains, which is a kind of nice little jargony title, which I suspect many people in the street outside would not understand, but no doubt it will all become clear as we work through the presentations. And I'm really hoping that this is going to be an interactive session so that when they've finished, we might have a brief discussion. I might ask a few questions of them, but we've got an hour and a half, and I really want to hear from some of the people in the floor. So please, as they are talking, note down your questions, and we'll come to you and take as many as possible. So what is this thing, a value chain? I'm an economist, so I have a fairly conventional view, I guess, of what a value chain is. And a value chain starts with a raw material, which in our wisdom, we price at zero. Zero. The raw material in the ground, zero value. And then gradually people do things to this raw material and it travels around the world and it has value added to it by people working and by investors investing and demanding a return. And you have this fascinating dynamic going on that at each stage, the people working on it want to add as much value as they can because that enables their business to grow. But at the next stage, the value is reflected in the price. And obviously, people want it to be as cheap as possible. So you've got this kind of competitive tension between value. And then once you get to the final product, so it's a smartphone, and it might be costing you $1,200. How is that $1,200 divided up between the many different people who have, and businesses who've worked on this stuff? From the people who dug it out of the ground to the guys who have done the advertising on television and the retailers who are finally selling it. So these three dimensions are all really important. There's the material dimension, the tons of stuff, which at World Resources Forum, we're always very interested in that. There's the money dimension, the fact that at each stage in the value chain, money changes hands and value is added. And there's the geopolitical dimension in that all this happens in lots of different countries. And with the tensions that we see in the world at the moment, clearly this is perceived as a problem if those countries are playing an absolutely critical role and they might not be friendly. And so the whole dimension of critical raw materials is trying to reflect a lot of that stuff. And the final thing I'll say, of course, is that I've missed out what is just about the most important part of the value chain, which we're very much concerned with at WRF, which is that at each stage of these processes, monetary value is added, but very often environmental value is subtracted. So in addition to this more valuable material ending up in the final product, we get a whole stream of negative environmental values associated with each of these processes. I heard a lovely remark in one of the earlier sessions. Someone said, well, of course, in Europe, a fundamental principle is the polluter pays principle. Now, I've been in this game long enough to know that in Europe, as well as everywhere else in the world, the main rule of the environment is that the polluter does not pay. We don't pay for carbon or anything like enough. We don't pay for the real cost of extraction of raw materials so that we know these mining sites are sites of devastation very often. And then right the way through, we get a whole series of environmental impacts, which we don't pay for. And when politicians try to persuade their voters to pay for them, their voters are extremely resistant to that. So this is what I understand as kind of the extractive value chain. Starts with the raw material, ends up in landfill, with a whole range of negative environmental impacts and perhaps negative social impacts on the way. And that's what we're trying to change in discussions like this, but also obviously in the real world outside. And these are our four clever people who are going to tell us how to do that. So we're going to start with Peder Jensen, who works for the European Environment Agency. And I think that's, he's also a long distance runner, by the way, and has did one of these crazy things, which I don't even understand, of running very long distances. Peder, I'm going to ask you to set the scene.
Okay, thank you very much. Is this one? Yeah. If we want to talk about running, I think it's over drinks afterwards. So thanks for that prompt. But what we're looking for here, is change. We're discussing change. We want things to change. And if I had been listening to what people have been saying over the past now close to 2 days, it is that we don't know where these ages of change are. Hans Breunings, he was talking about the global resources outlook. He was talking about some of the power brokers in Davos. They should change it. Julia Steinberger said, no, we should look for the young people because they are changing. Ernst von Weizsäcker said, nobody will vote for me if I try to change anything. So we don't know how to change. I think in my view, my starting point is that when we talk about circular economy and regenerative value chains is part of that, then what we are essentially trying to do is to some extent to protect our way of life, because that is trying to hold on to the lifestyle that we have become accustomed to. This whole element of sufficiency that is also added to this conference is something that we have to take a lot more serious if we really are serious about this change. But that requires changes to the systems. It requires changes to everything that we do. If we take a step back to the 1960s, we had astronauts flying around the moon for the first time. And for the first time, we saw pictures of this little biosphere that we are living in. We saw our little spaceship. We saw that we have an endowment of resources. Actually, we have quite a lot of resources, more than we can use, but we have a rather small atmosphere and even smaller biosphere. And that's the part that we are screwing up with the way that we're doing it. And that is why the sufficiency element has to come in there. The circular economy element can only help repair some of the elements of that. So sufficiency has to come on top of that. But we have the knowledge. We have all of these, the panels, the IPCCs, the IRPs, the IPBES, and so on, and they generate the knowledge, but we are not really trying to use that, because on our spaceship here, we have a crew that is divided. We ask, what is in it for me? We are trying to protect our own lifestyle. And as long as we continue to do that, then we are only repairing some of these small problems. At the end of the Cold War, around 1990, we saw the emergence of a unipolar world. We thought that now we can all work together. Now we can start to solve many of the issues at a global scale. But we lost a few decades more being busy trying to make us all richer and make us all consume even more. We can see that the impacts of climate, the impacts on biodiversity was increasing very strongly at that time. Now we are moving into a different phase. And I'm saying that almost with a bit of optimism. And I'll come back to why I say that. We are starting to see the paradigm that the West has rolled out over the rest of the world being challenged by other parts of the world. And we are trying now to use trade policy as a way to try to address that. We don't want to buy certain things in Russia. We have reluctance in how we want to deal with China and so on and so forth. If you look at the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, that's an element of our reaction to a changing world. But it is not talking about how can we consume less. There's a little bit on more efficient use of resources, but it's mostly about how can we be more self-sufficient, either from primary sources or from secondary sources. So it's very much about continuing the model as we have seen it. One of the things that the European Environment Agency is doing now is to see whether we can find a little bit of light in this situation by trying to say that when we do try to look at where we buy our resources and for political reasons choose to buy them in some places, can we actually try to make an environmental argument to buy things from somewhere else? We are working with a number of pilot studies where we are looking at nickel and rare earth elements and say, if we do not buy them where we used to buy them for political reasons, but buy them somewhere else, is there an environmental benefit that can actually be gained from that? And for nickel, right now, it appears that there are certainly something to be gained there. There is always a risk that this is a zero-sum game. So if we buy more in Canada, as an example, then we will be buying less somewhere else. And somebody else will be buying what we are not buying, and then it becomes a zero-sum game. But there are some small things that we can do. But I think in the bigger picture, I'm afraid that this is not going to solve the issue that we have with climate and with biodiversity. We need something that is much stronger than that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do all of the smaller things, because in this session here, we are focusing on something that is one corner of a much bigger problem. And with that, I think I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Peder. And lots of food for thought there. I'll come back to you on the trade aspect of that, the geopolitics around that, when we move into the discussion. But we'll move on to our second speaker, who is a distinguished academic from the University of Nottingham in the UK, Professor Siddharth Kara. And you, I think, are going to talk a bit about transparency and responsibility in business.
Thank you, Paul, for moderating this discussion, and I'm very honored to be on the stage today with my esteemed colleagues. You heard enough from me yesterday, so I'll keep my comments brief, and we'll look forward to our question and answer period. The essential message I'd like to convey is similar to the one I tried to suggest yesterday, that transitioning or moving from an extractive to a regenerative supply chain requires that those at the top of the chain understand the realities at the bottom in order to address them. You cannot regenerate that which you don't accept has been amputated. And I choose that word consciously. The lives and livelihoods and the environments of the people at the bottom of these value chains have been and continue to be amputated by the broader global economic order. And that leads to the series of buzzwords around transparency and accountability, but those are the right words. Those stakeholders at the top of the chain, in order to understand and accept responsibility for the extractive and exploitative realities at the bottom, can only do so if they have the ability to see, and that gets to transparency, or the desire, and often it's the desire that's missing, and then can take responsibility, hopefully. And the important thing here is oftentimes the efforts to interrogate a value chain, audit a value chain, understand a value chain, are looking in the wrong places and talking to the wrong people. And it's the voices of the people who count most, the voices of the people who live and work at the bottom of the global economic order, that aren't incorporated into discussions about how to improve their condition, their livelihoods, their lives, address the injustices they're experiencing. And so I think part of this transition from extractive to regenerative has to be built on incorporating very consciously and extensively the voices of the people who toil at the bottom of these chains. The last thing I'll say, to pick up on something you said, Paul, and this is, people have been talking about this for decades, but somehow it still isn't achieved, but this allocation of value, which gets so heavily concentrated at the top. And it's that lack of equitable allocation of value that leads to so many of the negative consequences down to the bottom of the chain. That $1,200 smartphone or $100,000 electric vehicle or $60 shirt or gosh, I had dinner last night with a colleague and, you know, $60 Swiss franc, so and such dish, you know, all the value of that is enjoyed at the top and so little and too little. And as I said, people have been talking about this from coffee beans to cobalt to shirts to everything to seafood. Too little of the value is allocated towards the bottom. And I think you cannot hope to achieve a regenerative value chain until you push back at that capitalist thrust to accrue value for shareholders and stakeholders at the top of the chain at the expense of the participants at the bottom. That has to be reorganized and reordered to some extent. The difference between a reasonable existence and a very miserable cycle, regenerating cycle of misery at the bottom of the chain is oftentimes just a small amount of value. The number of families I've spoken to, you know, my talk yesterday about Congo and cobalt, the number of families who told me I have to bring a child because we can't pay the school fees. What are the school fees? $5 a month. And it's that gap that, I mean, we pay more for a latte 3 times a day than $5, which they need per month for school fees. And so then what is the child to do? Come and earn the extra 50 cents. And why are they in that predicament, mother and father? Because they're only themselves earning $2 or $3 a day. And at the top of the chain, we know what the value is of the products incorporating the resources they're extracting. And if just a small modicum of that value was reallocated and shared respectfully with the people at the bottom, it would really, the multiplier effect, the positive impact on their lives is 1,000 times what would be lost at the top. And I'll stop there because I promised to keep my remarks brief. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Siddharth. That is indeed an elephant in the room that we've been talking about for as long as I've been in this game. And I'm going to ask you how we make progress on that. So just
I shot myself in the foot.
Bear that in mind. Okay, so our next speaker is Murtiani Henry Wardani, and I hope that's acceptable, if not right. And she comes from the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining and Metals. And you've got a couple of slides, which we'll look forward to. Over to you, please.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here. And thank you for the opportunity for the AGF to share our thoughts and observations from the work that we do with our member states. So I represent the extractive part of the theme of our discussion this afternoon. Just to give a bit of a background, the AGF, what is it? The AGF is the Intergovernmental Forum, yes, I'm looking at the slide, on mining, minerals, metals, and sustainable development. We are a voluntary initiative that came out of the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development, because at the time it was recognized that there needs to be a forum or a body to ensure that mining operations, mining activities align with the Sustainable Development Goals. And the idea was proposed by South Africa and Canada. We became a UN Type 2 partnership in 2005. And since then, we've been growing and evolving. We are now at 81 member states. I want to give you a bit of a background about our work because it's really relevant to the discussion that we've been hearing the last 2 days, and especially the sobering reality that Siddharth shared with us yesterday morning at the opening. Cobalt ASM, those are issues that we're dealing with our member states. And we help them, we support them in the context of the critical minerals or the minerals that we need for the energy and digital transition. We see this at the AGF, not just about the energy transition, but it's also about the digital transition. We start with just helping member states have the understanding that there's no universally agreed upon definition, right? The EU is referring to the minerals that we need as critical raw materials, EITI, and now IEA, they use the term energy transition minerals. So we start with the basic of making sure that everybody, our member states, we work with developed country members as well as developing country members. So members from regions where a lot of these minerals are coming from in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And we recognize that the definition is very country and context specific. The criticality and strategicality of these minerals change over time, depends with your resource endowment. I think Professor Liliana from Chile, was it yesterday or this morning, for highlighting the fact that in Chile, with respect to lithium, it's critical for Europe, but that's strategic for Chile. And this is something that we're working with our member states to help them determine the definition for themselves. We don't come up with the definition. They need to determine what it is, what is critical and strategic for them. We come up with the criticality criteria. We help them with that, with the framework, so that they can then develop their own definition. They can then develop their own mineral strategy, as well as the list that we know of, that we see most often. The list coming from the EU, coming from the US, coming from Canada. We do have some of our member states with their own lists. Brazil, South Africa, and India are coming up with their own, or they have issued their own list, but we need more of them. Every country needs to have their own list. And also our regional partners, we're working with ASEAN to develop the regional criteria for what is strategic, what is critical. In the context of regenerative value chain, recycling, reprocessing, many of our member states are still looking at mineral or mining from the upstream perspective. So it's just extraction. They're not seeing beyond that. So we're looking at mining from holistically across the value chains. So for countries that may not know what role they play in mining, for example, Brunei, Singapore, where there's little or no mining at all, what role can they play? What role can they contribute? And also, we help countries understand that a lot of these minerals and metals come from the co-production and byproduction of other minerals. You don't just get cobalt out of the ground, you get cobalt from copper. A lot of the issues coming out of or surrounding copper and cobalt from DRC around ASM, that is also something that we're addressing with our member states. Mining is here to stay, especially in the context of the future that we want, which is a cleaner, greener, more digitized and technology-driven future. I think Professor Julia Steinberger this morning said, we need these resources and minerals, but how much of it do we need of? And also the issues that we're facing, you know, it's not, the ASM issue is not strictly or exclusively around cobalt. We see it in other minerals as well. And the reality is we actually do need the ASM sector to produce a lot of these. The numbers are there. Maybe they're a little bit outdated, but how much of it do we need? We don't have enough of the supply. And the reality is the ASM actually plays a critical role in the surge or the growing demand of the minerals that we need for our greener, cleaner, lower carbon future. I think I will stop there for now.
Fine. Thank you very much indeed, Muciani, and we'll come back on that. I mean, just something that occurs to me from looking at your slide before that, which was just that 6 times more materials needed to produce an electric vehicle compared to a conventional car. But also, It's 2 to 3 times as much as that to produce an SUV electric vehicle than it is to produce a small electric vehicle. And SUV electric vehicles are currently the biggest selling form of electric vehicle in the United Kingdom. So that multiplication takes us straight back into the sufficiency discussion, that if everybody wants an electric SUV, well, we can expect to hit the buffers much more quickly in terms of the supply of these materials than we might otherwise do. Okay, so we've had 3 interventions. Matthew, you are the first. Matthew Fraser from Circle Economy. He's going to talk about the circular economy. Is this going to save us, Matthew, and turn our extractive into a regenerative value chain?
That is a big question. I don't know if I have an answer for you. I also, well, thank you very much for having me here. It's also great, also really to hear the different perspectives that have already emerged from the different panelists. I think for me, the title of this session was quite provocative, and it definitely got me thinking, you know, to what extent are we really capable of really moving towards regenerative value chains? And at Circle Economy, we really look at the metabolism, the sort of material diet almost of how our economy runs, and we're undergoing a massive dietary shift right now. So I think that really got my wheels spinning a little bit, and very much driven by that question. I think for me, it's, you know, really based on the goal, obviously, that we all need to agree on, is that we're really trying to maximize well-being for as many people on Earth as possible while operating within the boundaries of the planet. And I think that's a unbelievable question for which we still don't really have a clear compass for navigating. Maybe what I can do there, just on the metabolism element, is just paint a little bit of a picture of that transition. So if we kind of rewind back to 1900, there were about 1.6 billion people on Earth. By 2100, we'll be around 10 billion. Today, the majority of people still struggle to meet their basic needs. And just this year, we've crossed 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries. So you can see that this sort of solution space is shrinking very, very fast. And, you know, how we navigate the coming, 70 some years is going to be a monumental time in human history. Really how, in my mind, really how we configure and curate and manage ultimately resources in delivering needs is really the ultimate question that I'm concerned about. And, you know, I really look at kind of the key principles of a circular economy. You know, how can we narrow the amount of materials? How can we slow its use down? Of course, cycling, as we all know, and regenerating. All of those play a role, but I think ultimately, going back to the question, what we regenerate ultimately really does depend on the nature of the metabolism and how these materials are sort of transformed and exist today in our economy. If we rewind to kind of World War II, 1950, about 50% of total consumption of the global economy was biomass. Food and feed and other forms of biomass. By definition, highly regenerative. And I think that would have been a very different question if we had this panel back then. Today, less than 25% of total inputs to the global economy are biomass. Yet what we see, and obviously what's been touched on by the other panelists, are the expansion of minerals and metals has grown significantly. So representing well over 50% today. And in the future, we're going to rely even more on that. So when you say that mining is here to stay, that's absolutely for sure. I think we're very much committed to that path. But that also has a lot of complicating factors that maybe we can dive into. So, again, rewinding about 200 years ago, just by way of an example, the global economy was basically kind of handling and trading about 9 different metals, and that's about it. Today, every element of the periodic table has multiple forms of value in all kinds of sectors, and especially how these metals, these substances are actually combined into final goods, it makes it extremely challenging also to find, let's say, highly regenerative by design solutions. So very complex products with multiple technology metals, including EVs and electronics. They're very difficult to recycle and recover at high value across that full spectrum of materials. So I think, just kind of going back, obviously there is a role for, let's say, the traditional regenerative, biomass cycle. But I think when we look into the nature of the value chains, the metabolism of the future, technical cycling actually is going to be a key aspect of finding regenerative value, or building regenerative value chains, I should say. I would also want to build on that a little bit by saying, cycling is also not necessarily enough. So we talked about kind of EVs take up, 6 times the materials of an average car, and I'm fully on board with the need really to think deeply about how do we systematically block, vehicles like SUVs that are just massively wasteful by design. Maybe actually I can give an example. So I heard recently a bit of a bottom-up study. Actually, if you look at the total fleet of vehicles that are on the road today, even though we have a lot of growth in the EV sector, only about 1% of our total fleet today existing are electric. And to replace that current fleet, just to replace it one time, the estimated volume of materials would be about 3 billion tons of lithium, excuse me. And if we take our current rate of extraction, that equals about 700 years. So it really kind of does bring this down to a sufficiency argument where we really have to think kind of deeply, how do we actually allocate these materials, and where do we put them, and how do we use them in an effective way? It also poses a really direct challenge to cycling, because we need to extract these first before we can cycle them. And of course, we can't always cycle at 100%. So we're losing quality and we're losing materials. So there's also a real clear limit to cycling. I think for me, that maybe it's the way that I would end it, and kind of ultimately what I land on with this question of, moving from extractive to regenerative value chains is this. I think actually finding ways to fundamentally use less and use longer, and designing that in a way, and building incentives and building the enabling environment in a way that really mitigates the rebound effect is going to be critical, really critical to managing this. So I come from an organization called Circle Economy. Our office is based in Amsterdam, and I really hate using the example of bicycles, but I will today, because it really does illustrate this point perfectly. So there's the statistic, about half of all trips that we make are within 5 kilometers. And if we think about designing our cities in a way that really easily enables, human-powered transport, walking and cycling, the average person could actually reduce their own personal annual carbon footprint by about 70%. That's really significant, your own individual carbon footprint associated with transport. In Amsterdam and throughout the Netherlands, and actually I would say even throughout Europe at this point, it's really common even to see bikes that are 60, 70. I have a bike, I think, from 1930, so almost 90 years old. Super easy to repair, very simple parts, basic materials, and also very hard to rebound. I think when you design a city, for example, in a way that is inherently very cycling friendly, it's very hard to imagine why people would buy a car in a sense that, that landscape has really been designed for people. So it's very hard to kind of rebound in a sense out of that. So I think that's actually a really simple kind of, a bit of a oft used, but really good example of actually how a solution from a resource management point of view is really kind of striking an ideal in many ways. Very, very few resources, very long lifetimes, easy to repair, and kind of fundamentally, if designed right, if the enabling environment is designed right, very difficult to kind of, rebound out of that and find yourself in a spiraling situation where people are driving, SUVs made out of, all kinds of very rare metals that are very hard to cycle. So, well, maybe I'll just leave it at that. I think that was my first reaction to the title of the event, and a little bit how I think about kind of how circular economy can play a role.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I've, needless to say, got lots of questions, but I said we were going to go and go to you. You've heard 4 very different presentations, different aspects of this shift from the extractive to the regenerative. Are there any questions that people want to follow up right now, or do you want to think a bit more before you enter the water? Gentleman there, please introduce yourself and tell us who you are.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. My name is Vijay. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm just a curious fly on the wall here. So my question could be as dumb as it comes. So 2 questions to the whole panel. One, when we are talking about regenerative value chains, I don't remember hearing about repurposing or re-extracting all the minerals that are required for building future EVs, or materials that would require cobalt or other elements from condemned vehicles or decommissioned products that has all these minerals. So number 1. And question number 2, Matthew, you mentioned about cycling infrastructure. I live in Germany, and just recently Germany announced that they are going to invest more on the roads and less on cycling infrastructure. So there is a huge gap here, political commitment. So I would be grateful if the whole panel would touch up on these 2 aspects when we think about regenerative value chains. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think if we just go down the line, it might be a bit much, but I'll allow them, obviously, if they want to come in on either of these or both of these questions, to do that. I'll start with you, Matthew, because I think that first question was mainly to you. The whole business of designing for recycling. I know we shouldn't. Anyway, you come in on that.
It's a significant problem, and that's also really what I was trying to touch on a little bit. Is at least to me, when we say regenerative, I naturally think of kind of the biocycle, closing the carbon cycle. And when we look at the type of metabolism that the global economy will ultimately run on in the coming years, it's technical materials all the way. And right now, there's basically lacking legislation about how, what volumes or what standards or how even to begin to recover a lot of this in a serious way. I think that there's progress ultimately that's being made. But well, maybe I would just say kind of one thing, at least from a policy point of view, that I'm interested in now is coming out of France, where you have a product repairability rating that will also turn into a product durability rating. And I think these kinds of things are well needed across the board. I mean, it just needs to be introduced. Very, very stringent standards on how to recover optimally these materials. Yeah, I mean, it's maybe not shocking to hear your example coming out of Germany on that. I mean, there's this huge auto lobby.
Let's come to that second one in a minute. Any other contributions on this design for recyclability, for reuse? Peter?
I think the one of the issues is also the great difference in wealth levels. I mean, in salary levels. It's costly to extract materials from products. It often requires a lot of manual labor to be able to get these elements out, which means that we would rather send them off to countries where salary levels are much, much lower. And that means that the incentive to try to produce products that are easier to recycle is handed off to someone else. And I think the the wealth levels across the world is part of the explanation why it's like that. Because we don't have an incentive to do things. We just send it off to somewhere else. We dump things somewhere else.
A fairly shocking statistic from the previous session that I was attending was that 85% of waste electrical products are recycled informally, which means almost entirely by people with no qualifications, who will simply extract them in a way that is extremely toxic, bad for them, and only recovers a small fraction of the value is potentially in the material. So that's a fact.
I think we used to see that in Europe where with cables that were being burned and also get the metals out of the plastics and so on. I think that has largely disappeared, but I think it has just moved to other places in the world.
So let's jump to the second question. Siddharth, infrastructure. Infrastructure is pretty important. We had the example there of Germany, but in the countries where there's mining, very often a mine will provide some infrastructure. Just talk a little bit about your kind of understanding of what kind of infrastructures we ought to be providing for a regenerative value chain.
Well, I would probably defer to some of my colleagues on, urban design that optimizes regenerative urban life and promotes bicycles, public transportation. I divide my time between London and Los Angeles, and they couldn't be more opposite in terms of public transport friendliness. You can get around London on the tube very easily, access most everything, walking, biking, tubing, and you can't get anywhere in Los Angeles unless you have a car, and most people have big giant SUVs. Enormous 8-seater SUVs, just guzzling up and down long freeways across that sprawling region. So Los Angeles, I guess no one was thinking about it at the time, but one of the most poorly designed cities from a regenerative standpoint, or a low carbon footprint standpoint. European cities tend to be a little more compact, New York City, another example, Boston. I think with infrastructure that's stimulated by mining activity, my primary experience would again be in Congo. There's just one road that goes through the mining provinces, one paved road, I should say, that goes through the mining provinces, and it was built and paved by China for the purpose of ferrying minerals to the border. And of course, that has some positive benefits for the local population in order, from the standpoint of easing their ability to get around or up and down the mining provinces. But it also has led to a huge increase in vehicular traffic. And I can tell you that none of those big cargo trucks are very well maintained, and they tend to be spewing out all kinds of miserable grime and soot on the villages that have come to inhabit the roadside. And then this gets to that same issue of, is it clean? Is it sustainable? Is my supply clean? Well, even just the transport of minerals from Kolwezi to the border at Kasumbalesa or Kipushi is responsible for a massive amount of air pollution. And then at the border, those trucks, I put a video up on social media some time ago. There's a line of cargo trucks stacked with minerals at Kipushi at the border road and Kasumbalesa that is several kilometers long. And it takes them up to a week of just idling and slowly moving forward to cross the border. And you can see the villages and the people living on either side of that road just covered in grime and soot. Now, is that green? The minerals will ultimately get here and support our green economy, but it's very black and sooty and grimy for the people there. And people don't even talk about the basic thing of transporting these minerals from a mine just to the border, let alone further on the chain. And so that comes back to what I said about, I understand accessing the truth is difficult. It requires time, but even when effort is made, people are often looking in the wrong place and talking to the wrong people. And if you just spend enough time, you'll see there are so many issues that degrade the quality of life at the bottom of the chain that could be addressed, that can be addressed very easily, very simply, and with a small amount of resources, if there was but the will to do so.
So I'm going to come to you absolutely, Mutiani, then. Do these issues feature in your discussions in the Intergovernmental Forum? I mean, are you talking about how do we pay these ASM miners more? Because as Siddharth said, the effect of paying them 3 times their current wage on the price of the final product would be indistinguishable. We wouldn't have a clue. We wouldn't even notice it was there in the price of the final product. Similarly, probably cleaning up the various mining processes. I mean, are these really live matters for discussion? And how do you talk about them?
Definitely, thank you. I think we're also missing perhaps one more perspective, which is the perspective of our sister organization, perhaps the International Council on Mining and Metals and Minerals. They represent the private sector voices. IGF works with the member states, the producing countries, the consuming countries, even though producing countries are also consumers. But if I may just reply to your reprocessing of minerals, that is something that we're also actually looking into. And it's really in the tailings and the waste of a lot of these minerals. But right now, we start at the very basic, which is the mining codes. In many countries, tailings and waste are not included in the mining codes, or they're treated as waste, as a liability, rather than an asset. So if the law does not allow you to touch the tailings and the waste, how can you even begin to reprocess? So we start there with our member states. And then with the cycling infrastructure, if you look at EVs, you have to look at the EV itself, the car itself. Then you have to consider the EV battery, the engine that powers the vehicle, and then the EV infrastructure. So a lot of these numbers that are floating around, it really depends which part of it you're looking at. The EV infrastructure, when you talk to our member states in Africa, they want stable access to electricity first. Let's think about EV later. And the discussions that we're having with our member states are really touching on ASM. How do we formalize them? Do we formalize them? Is that the right solution for the country? We're also helping governments engage and have a discussion with the large-scale miners, because the infrastructure that you see, the roads, the public health clinics that are provided for, they are the facilities for within the mining operations. But then how do you extend the benefits so that the local communities surrounding the mining areas can also benefit from the infrastructure? We do see mining companies decarbonizing. They're switching to electric vehicles, which some of you may argue, well, is that really solving the problem? It's reducing the diesel, right? We're switching to renewable energy for the mining operations. We see that. So these are a lot of the, I don't want to give you hope. I want to showcase the fact that these are real life discussions that the IGF are having, not just with member states, but also with our private sector partners as well.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm hoping that's given lots of food for thought. I can see a gentleman here. If you would just wait a minute, I can see a lady at the back, and I'll go one-on-one if I possibly can. So would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I have 2 quick questions.
Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Hi, my name
Thanks.
is Joanna Murth. I'm a master's student and also work for an environmental NGO. My question is twofold. One, to what extent is in your opinion, are ecosystem service assessments an adequate tool of determining value before the extraction process takes place? And also, secondly, to what extent is reclamation included in the value chain assessment? Thank you.
By reclamation, you mean end of life, end of mine closure and remediation?
Yes,
Yeah,
and returning to
Okay.
a natural environment.
So two different questions, both very important questions. Who wants to take the ecosystem services question? Peter?
Should I say something?
Well, you are the European Environment Agency. Come on.
Yes. I think what the ecosystem services is trying to do is to try to find some kind of a value that we can assign to ecosystems to somehow illustrate what it is that they're providing to us. But there's a big element of non-valuable value, whatever you call it. I'm sure you have a proper word for that. But that you don't really classify there. Sentimental value, no, sentimental value sounds wrong, but there's a lot that is not qualified in there. And it's a bit like when you're talking about the resources in the ground that has no value until we start digging them out. That kind of thing is, I don't think, fully covered when we are trying to value the ecosystem. But we are trying to determine that the bees have value because they do something for us, and in that sense, trying to put some value to it.
Thank you. That's a lovely question. One of my master's students did her dissertation on precisely this ecosystem issue with some very interesting results. So that's something we really need to think about, I think. And the methods of ecosystem valuation that I'm aware of are wholly inadequate. So if you can come up with something better, please do. So the second question, which was about mine remediation. Is this one for you, Murchani?
We do work in mine remediation. Well, there's a program, one of our areas of work is really post-mining and mine closure. And many people tend to think, oh, post-mining, we do that after the mine is closed. No, you do that before you even begin the mining operations. And many times what we have found is member states or countries, governments are left with the cost, the social, environmental, and financial cost of cleaning up after the sites have been closed. They may have included an arrangement where the large-scale miner or private sector, a private operator contribute towards the costs, but usually that's undervalued. So, you know, we are really trying to help our member states to think about all the necessary criteria before you even issue a permit to explore, before you even issue a permit to start extraction. But it needs to start from the beginning. What we're finding is many of our member states, from the legacy from previous arrangements, they end up, you know, left holding the bag with all the remediation costs. So we're working sort of in both ways for the new mines, and especially in the context of critical minerals. Let's do it right. We have the opportunity to not repeat the mistakes from the oil, gas, coal extraction. So this is the opportunity, and they are asking. Everything that we do are based on the requests of our members. We can propose ideas and highlight to them, these are the important issues that you need to consider. But at the end of the day, the request comes from our members, and these are issues that they're asking us. We can't do things the way we used to be doing previously. We want to make sure that, you know, mining is done properly. Mining is done more responsibly, more sustainably, and more equitably and fairly. So this is now the work that we're doing as well with our member states.
I mean, the tension that occurs to me when I hear you talking about that, and obviously I'd entirely agree about the need to sort all that out before you start, and to get the mining company to contribute a fund that is there at the end of mine life, 30 years later, perhaps,
right,
in order to clean it up, is that all that is going to slow down the process. And there is such a rush to get these minerals out in order for the transition to take place now and over the next 10 years, that there's going to be enormous pressure and tension not to do that.
Mhm.
And then you've got the normal pressures on just lots of countries just want foreign direct investment.
Mhm.
FDI, get the FDI in, ask the questions later. And that's going to be tricky, squaring all that. Siddharth.
I don't think I have much to add to the
Okay.
wonderful comments from my colleagues there.
Fine. Okay, there was a gentleman here. You were very patient. So your turn.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan Kosmo. I work for the German Environment Agency. And I'd like to come back to this question of asymmetric allocation of costs along global supply chains. So we heard about the diagnosis that this is asymmetric, that global supply chains go from low value add and high impact to high value add and low impact. And I think this, I'd like to know more about the therapy. What can we do? What can we do to make this more symmetric? And I think this is really at the core of more sustainable supply chains. And when we have more and more laws implemented in Europe, which demand supply chain due diligence from companies. And I think unless this question is resolved, there's a high risk that those laws will generate a lot of paper, but not material outcomes on the ground. And so I'd like to learn more about the therapy. What kind of measures, instruments are there to make this more symmetric, to set the, to allocate costs in a way that the incentives and also the capabilities are right to protect humans and the environment along the global supply chains. So are we talking about taxes and tariffs, about carbon border adjustment, or other biodiversity border adjustment mechanisms? Or are we talking about price premiums and sustainability standard systems? Or are we talking about consumer eco-labels? Or are we talking about completely different institutional setups like the World Trade Organization or the World Bank? I'd like to hear your views or your ideas about that.
Siddharth, this is a pretty obvious follow-on from your initial presentation, so I'm going to come to you.
I said I shot myself in the foot with that one. I mean, there's a Nobel Prize waiting for someone to answer your question, to solve this riddle. As I said, people have been pulling their hair and teeth on this long before I was, for generations, and it's not just, let's take one further step back. It's not just the dynamic between developing economies and developed economies, but even inside developed economies. Amazon warehouse workers go on strike because they're not getting paid enough to work their 80 hours a week. And right now in Hollywood, the writers and actors are on strike because they're not getting paid enough by the fat cat studio executives. And you see this, the public transport workers in England are on strike, off strike, on strike. Same thing, it's the same objection that so much value is just being absorbed at the top and too little to the bottom. People can't make ends meet. They can't survive even within developed economies, let alone when we're talking global south up to global north, where the asymmetry is multiplied even more. I wish I had the answer. Is it taxes? Is it regulatory efforts? Is it tariffs? I'm sure all of this has been tried, and yet we find greater and greater asymmetries as the years go by. I mean, who would have thought there'd be people with a net worth of $200-300 billion while billions of people barely make $2 or $3 in a day? That it's just massive extremes of wealth disparity. People have talked about taxing the wealthy, and the question always is, okay, then what? Can those funds reasonably and reliably be reallocated down to the bottom of the chain, or will it just be siphoned off by one corrupt official after another, and nothing actually gets to the people who need it? And I want to have an answer for you. Believe me, I want to have an answer for all the people I've met across the global south for 2 decades now, who are asking the exact same question. Why is it when I'm picking this coffee bean and I know the world is drinking this coffee. They may not know what a latte goes for in Copenhagen or London or New York, but they know that they're barely surviving. And the world relies on, to get to work each day with that cup of coffee. And the same is true for these minerals. And it's becoming increasingly true as people are aware now at the bottom that they're eking out this miserable existence in order to enable our gadget-driven lifestyles and this scramble for EV adoption. And we're talking, I think Matthew mentioned, 1% of cars are now EVs. And so if we're talking about even some kind of 10%, 20% fleet replacement, these are billions upon billions of tons of minerals, and there's not nearly the mining production capacity to meet demand now. So what does that imply? It implies this scramble will only become more feverish. And if you appreciate that 90% of the mining workforce around the world is ASM, that means they're responsible for it and will become increasingly responsible for that production. There'll be more and more pressure for local communities to get minerals out of the ground for penny wages and up the chain. And so it's only going to get worse. And the last thing I'll say, which I think is important to acknowledge, that people in the Congo have said and I'm sure the same is true in Peru and Indonesia and other countries, that in 2 generations, the scramble will be over for what they have under their feet right now. The reserves of cobalt and their reserves of lithium and so on will largely be exhausted in 2 generations. And by that point, there'll be newer technologies or better recycling or whatever. And what will they be left with? A destroyed environment, a contaminated environment, more severe levels of poverty, and nothing but just valueless dirt under their feet. And so where does that leave them? And that's sort of virus thinking. Consume the host, devour it, and move on. And so is that what our global economic order is structured like? Is it a virus on the global south? And if it is, then that needs to be, back to your question, reimagined in some way, and some brilliant economist out there is going to figure this out. Sadly, I wish it were me. It would help me sleep better at night, because I've seen the consequences of this. And so when the people at the bottom of the chain are left with nothing and the world moves on and they're worse off than before, where does that leave all of us? And I think that's a question we don't ask often enough.
Thank you, Siddharth. I mean, this isn't, don't look at economists. Economists aren't, this is a politics problem. This is a politics problem. It's not an economic problem. I mean, the truly shocking statistic, even from my own country, the UK, is that over this period of high inflation, which we've all been going through, the only income group that has had a pay rise significantly in excess of inflation is the top 1%. They've had 16% over this period of inflation, while the public sector workers, the health workers we were all clapping for every Thursday, COVID workers, they've had 6% at a time when their pay has been devalued successively year on year since 2010. And so they're worse off. They're not even keeping up with inflation. So that's a politics problem. That's actually, we can vote for people who would not allow that to happen, but we don't. We're not even given the option, actually, which is very interesting. Thanks, Siddharth. That was a very passionate statement. Gentleman, lady there.
It's nice that gender equality is not always that equal. Hi, my name is Mausima Faruqi. I'm from Minehut, and this is kind of a cat among the pigeons kind of question. Because honestly, some of the stuff that you guys have been saying is depressing, because it's not happening. We've got academics, we've got think tanks, we've got government forums, we've got the European agency there. And all of this thought about how do we rejuvenate it, the answers aren't exciting or practical, or there are barriers that are beyond our reach. So cat among the pigeon question, if you guys were not here for each panelist, who would you sort of say, in my place, for this person from this background or whatever, who would you nominate to sit in your chair in this panel and say, there might be answers there.
Boy, well, there we are. Now you've put people on the spot. Thank God I'm the moderator. That's all I say about. That's all I'm going to say about that. Okay. Well, who would like to have their feathers ruffled first? Better, please.
I think if I should nominate someone, I would probably nominate Frans Timmermans from the European Commission. He's been very outspoken on trying to change the way we think about the environment. But maybe then to take a step back, I think the essence is that we are much better at analyzing the problem than we are at pointing a solution that can actually work. And I think that is where you're hitting your head right on the nail. And I hope it doesn't hurt too much. But we tend to have these sessions where we describe what is going wrong, whether it's cobalt extraction, whether it's anything else. And we talk about small things that can help here and there, but the big thing that can really change, where it's not the economists, but the politicians that should really act, we have a hard time pointing at what is exactly that can actually work. But Frans Timmermans has made a very passionate plea on things that could be done better.
I mean, the very interesting thing is going to be whether anyone votes for him.
Yeah.
I mean, we all heard Ernst earlier today that if you say what needs to be said, no one will vote for you. And certainly that's happening in the UK at the moment, where a general election coming up and no one's saying anything.
Let's hope he proves
they're
them
afraid
wrong.
if they open their mouth, the opinion polls will suddenly shift in the other direction. Do any other panelists want to respond to that? Who would you nominate in your place?
It's an extremely good question, very good question.
I think I would nominate the ASM workers or the community leaders or somebody from the community, because they're really the ones who are impacted. To Siddharth's point, you know, like 80% of what we need, what we want. Do we really need them? That's also a question for us, right? Do we really need, what exactly do we need? Do we want an electric vehicle, or do we need an electric? I think we need stable electricity first before that. So I think I would really nominate the ASM workers and the community, local communities.
Well, you've done a very good job, Siddharth, of talking on behalf of the ASM workers and the people who do very little. Is there someone who could do a better job?
I was actually, Murtiani stole my answer, so I'm very cross.
We're
But
on the
no,
same page.
I just want to say, I hope that the perception isn't, I know what you're saying, but that I'm speaking on behalf of. I'm trying to be a pass-through. You know, I went into the dirt and tried to find the truth, tried to talk to people and then bring their voices to a world that didn't see them and can't hear them. And to the extent their voices are heard more broadly than before, then that effort, that endeavor has in my mind been successful. But I will also answer your question. I'm going to cheat a little bit and not pick a living person. I'm going to go and sticking with my ethnicity, I'm going to invent a time machine, go back, find Mahatma Gandhi and bring him here. And the reason I say that is I think what's needed is leaders with force of will and courage. We're not afraid of the consequences of doing what's right. And Gandhi said many, many things. I mean, two of my favorite things, you know, in response to when there's this phrase, British Empire said this in its height, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And Gandhi said, well, that's because God doesn't trust them in the dark. But the statement, the other one that he said that I always keep to mind, which I think is more applicable here, is live simply so that others may simply live. And I think that's the essence of everything we're talking about. We are so wound up in consumption. We are so hypnotized by the marketing that we receive to keep consuming, that this is somehow the barometer of our value. Look what I have. Look what I've accumulated. Look what I'm wearing and driving. And that this is now how we assign value to ourselves in our time on this planet. And it's the other way around. It should be. And so that's why I say I'll get a time machine and bring Gandhi back, because I think he had it right, and he's not the only one, that we have to live simply because other people are just trying to survive. And if we adopt this colonial mentality of accumulate and extract, it comes at great cost and consequence to the people at the other side of that transaction. And I think it's about moral force of will and courage to stand up when the cane is coming down and go to back of the line and walk to the front again and take the cane again until that arm is too tired of beating you. And then you charge forward with your message. And that's the force of will he inspired. And there are other leaders throughout history and maybe today that none come to mind who would inspire that level of rigor and courage and disregard for their own personal cost to do what's right. And I think that's what the world so sorely needs.
Thank you, Siddharth. Matthew, have you found the answer to the circular economy from someone else?
It may sound like a cop-out, but I really do defer my answer. I see that there's only 5 minutes left, and I would love to give the audience
there is indeed. Okay, so let's have a look and see what sort of questions we've got now coming up. I can see two more, so I can see three. I'll take them in quick succession, and then we'll have and there's a fourth one there, and so that always brings up more hands. So just bring in the clock down, and then we'll have a quick response. Panelists, just choose one of the questions, okay, to respond to. We'll start with this gentleman in the waistcoat.
Thank you. My name is Andre Langbost. I'm a business lawyer here on behalf of Eurosolar, and I've been as well lobbyist for solar industry in Europe. I think if you want to understand what happened as well in Congo, we need to know what's the reason for that. That is this, and our greed that we want to pay less for something, and the greed for the people who would like to earn much more money. And then next question is, how can we avoid this? And the question and the answer is transparency. You see, when I've been working as a lobbyist for solar industry, the question is, well, how can we distinguish European solar industry from other competitors? One point is ecological footprint. The other point is social footprint. And if we talk about social footprint, there had been one big point, and that was at that time, that was forced labor with the Uyghurs in China. Lots of people were talking about that. So what we need is some kind of transparency for all the minerals. And if, for example, we buy a telephone, it's quite easy to build it up in a blockchain where all the minerals come from, and then use a traffic light. When something is in bad condition, well, we put it red. And we need to force all the companies that produce something to put all the red lights on the top so that we can see it. Of course, on a mobile phone, we've got lots of components inside, so it's going to be a little bit complicated. But I think the majority of the companies do not want to have a red light.
Thanks very much. Transparency is one answer. I'm glad you qualified your quite easy towards the end of that, because I think that was necessary. There's a lady there, please.
Thank you. I'm Ruth Spencer from Antigua. I'm a local community representative. And the power is in the people, but many times, do the people trust us? Do we listen to them? When people trust us, they tell us their concerns, but we have to act in their interest. They have to see us working for them. And we have had problems in my country going up against not situations as bad as what I've seen in the presentation yesterday. But we have to build alliances. We have to strengthen these people. They have to have access to information. They could be there just working, and don't even know the conditions at the global level. We are here talking about them, but they probably don't even know what's going on. How many times these people their human rights, no access rights, no consultation, no participation. So we as CSOs, local community people, have to take on new roles and responsibilities to find solutions. So thanks for sharing, but we really have to build the trust with those people and empower them to get solutions to these crises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a gentleman at the back here, I think. A gentleman at the back and then someone down here. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Ekins. I'm Mohit Chaubey. I'm from Geneva Graduate Institute, a student there. Two questions for the panel, whoever wants to respond. One is that regarding product design. So would you say that interusability and common designs among products from different companies, would you think that would be a good solution to reduce the consumption of materials? And also, would you think that rethinking the current patent regime and the IPR regime, because often a lot of good designs are not being taken up in the other parts of the world because they have been patented? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Two very specific questions. Thanks. I hope we get some expert answers from my left. And the final gentleman here.
Thanks very much. My name is Michael Haschke. We're working for the company DMT. We are providing mining services literally to the world, to some of the global players in this world. Your panel has drawn a rather dark picture. And having spent a lot of time on the ground in geology, I wonder whether all of this is representative. I don't see all of this. Please allow me to make two examples. Siddharth, I really enjoyed your talk yesterday, cobalt mining in Congo. But our company went into Congo. We have audited a cobalt company. We did not see that. So I would like to follow up with you on that part, on how we can eliminate this discrepancy, whether why do we not find these mines? For us, this mines was operational, fairly sustainable. So, and you mentioned this is what you see is happening to all of them. So this is something I would really love to follow up on. Moriarty, I would like to follow up on what you said. You said the mining does not have contingency for post-mining. Yes, they do, and I have seen it. Some of the mines, uranium mines in Australia, they have post-mining reserves for cleanup, for remediation in the order of $1 billion. This is a uranium mine, right? Other mines might have lower parts. Let me enlighten the picture. You said you don't want to give the people hope. Allow me to give some hope. I'm working in several standardization panels, some of them the highest in the world, ISO on sustainable raw materials. Countries are sitting together as we speak. They are negotiating on sustainability standards. It's happening. But yes, there are a handful of countries who don't play along yet. But we are doing a lot of convincing. I'm actually one of the people who are trying to convince the different standardization bodies of the different countries to convince them. So far, we have achieved an absolute majority. I think we will succeed. So I think there is reason for quite a bit of hope on this side. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We could obviously go on, and as always happens, more hands have appeared out of the woodwork. Is it a quick one?
Very quick. Suzanne Kasia, co-founder, African Circular Economy Network. Materials as a service, that we stop handing over and selling resources and start leasing them so that Africa retains its wealth. What do you think about exploring this?
Okay, materials as a service. So we've had three actual questions, one on common design, one on intellectual property rights, and one on materials as a service. I very much welcome the call to hope, because without hope, we don't get out of bed on Monday morning, which is an important thing. So I'm going to start with you, Matthew. Answer the questions if you want to, or leave us with a final message.
Yeah, material as a service. The gentleman also mentioned kind of, I don't know if it was EPR, IPR, and also speaking directly to your point, I mean, I think there are a lot of things happening And we need, very, very quick feedback loops where we learn what works, how to magnify it, and go through the second, the third, and the 10th iteration to really scale. I think that is a little bit of the, maybe that's what I would end on, is a little bit, I'd really hate to leave everybody with the feeling of doom and gloom, but I think there are many, many things happening. It's just that they are very small, dispersed, and very focused on micro issues. And what we happen to be talking about today is a very, very high level, very complex situation. And of course, what we would like to see is, bigger bounds and bigger steps towards solutions. But I think all of these things are happening. I remember, 10, 12 years ago when I entered the circular economy space, it was just the metaphor, like people just started to think about, okay, it could be a closed loop. And now you have legislation and you have companies, going through all sorts of activities, groups, metrics. So it is happening, and that's a decade's time. So imagine where we could be in 10 years from now.
Thank you, Peter.
I'll try to address a little bit the issues on transparency and on information and empowerment, because I think if we look at inequality around the world, and some of the countries that have lower inequality within the countries are countries where you have empowered broad parts of the population to take part in decision making. And I think that requires a lot of transparency, it requires a lot of information. So if we want to engage the local communities, we have to make sure that they have the right to do so. But if we then look at what is happening around the world, places like Russia, places what we have seen in Brazil on Bolsonaro and so on, we have seen a rollback of involvement of civil society. So if we want that to happen, then we need strong democratic institutions to help push that. And I think that's one of the levers where the policymakers and the politicians should be in there working in order to ensure that people can claim their right in the process.
Murciani.
Yes. I want to ask you, what is the true cost of mining? And are we ready and willing to pay the true cost of mining? I'm not just talking about financial costs, the living wage for the ASM workers, but I'm talking about the true cost of transparency, of data sharing, production data, geological data, and also when the people tell us what they want, are we listening to the people? Are we giving them access to the information that we need? That means part of the cost. The sharing of benefits, the sharing of taxation, fair taxation. And to our colleague from DMT, I'm not negating the existence of post-mining. Some of them are good, robust arrangements. And also hope. It's only because we are finding in our work that there are some arrangements that are inadequate and that we have to go back to the drawing board and redo it. In terms of hope, I don't want to just give you hope, but I want to show you the concrete work that we are doing. And maybe some of them are a little bit baby steps to some of you, but for us, it's progress. It's concrete, tangible work that we're working with our member states. So I don't want to just leave you with hope. There's hope and there's the reality of what we're dealing with partners, member states, key stakeholders, community representatives, ASM workers. So I think I may have missed one other question, but I'm sorry, but I'm not answering the other person.
Well, we haven't answered the common design question, which I guess is more to do with Matthew, but I'm just going to continue up here because I'm looking at the clock and we're already over time.
I would frame it like this. Accurately assessing and understanding the scale and severity of an injustice is in point of fact, the first step in the act of hope. Because you cannot address something and aspire and hope to address it until you properly understand it and fully understand it. If you go into the doctor says, I'm really sorry, I have some bad news, you have a tumor. You have to know the grade, the scale, the severity, the spread until you know what the treatment is. And it's going to be hard to hear, and it's going to seem dark, but it's the only way to have hope for the path forward. And the same is true of human rights and justices. And candidly, those experiencing this misery are suffering far more than those of us in this room who have to hear about it. Hearing about it should be nothing. It's the least we should do. And if you choose to then go home and do nothing, so be it. But once you know and you hear about it, some level of your human conscience should be activated to think, even if it's small, there's something I have to do. And that is contributing to hope for the path forward. So listening to darkness is a much easier task than experiencing it. So let's all listen, keep our ears open, keep our hearts and eyes open, understand the realities may be worse than we'd like to admit, but that's the only way to find a productive and just path forward.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. That's great. Perhaps I could just have a final comment to this gentleman who asked us for hope. I mean, in the mining sector, are we mining better, by and large, than we did in the 1980s? No question. The answer to that is yes. Why are we doing that? Because civil society and host governments put pressure on the mining companies. They would not have changed the way they have. Are they doing enough? No. They still need to do much more, especially if we're going to have more mining. Are they talking the right talk? Yes, they are. I was amazed to hear at a conference in Brazil last week, the head of the Brazilian mining institutes, the association, IBRAM, saying things I never would have expected from him about respect for indigenous people, about gender equity, about the need to keep the forest standing, stuff that obviously under Bolsonaro, none of that stuff would have been remotely on the table. It's on the table now. Of course, Bolsonaro may come back, in which case, obviously, that rhetoric will disappear like the morning dew, and we'll be in a different place again. But I think our job, whether we're academics or CSOs or whatever we are, is to try to make sure that this blah, blah actually gets enacted on the ground. And you in the mining sector have a job to do in that respect. And it sounds as if you're doing your best. And I'm sure none of us can do more than that. So thank you very much. For me, that was actually a very nice session. So thank you to the audience and to my panelists. Thank you.